Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and adaptive decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, to make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today, it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. J Landry. Dr. Landry has studied circadian rhythms and sleep for over 25 years. He completed his graduate research at Simon Fraser University, examining circadian mechanisms of entrainment. He focused his research efforts on sleep, aging, and cognition in the Aging, Mobility, and Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at UBC. Dr. Landry's research there explored age-related changes in sleep duration efficiency and architecture that contribute or accelerate cognitive decline in older adults. As an academic, Glenn's goal was to develop chronotherapeutic interventions capable of delaying cognitive decline in older adults with the objective of improving quality of life, productivity, and extending capacity for independent living. Now, in private practice, Glenn is a sleep coach. He works with older adults, shift workers, and families to improve physical and mental health through better sleep quality by translating sleep science into practical interventions tailored to the client. Dr. Landry, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Now, I first heard of you. You were brought to my attention by a colleague of mine and someone you know, Staff Sergeant Pat Dick from the Abbotsford Police Department. So Pat reached out to me after you had been to Abbotsford Police and you did a full day training session there on sleep and sleep health for their officers. And Pat contacted me and said, you have to have Dr. Landry on the Trainer's Bullpen because what he has to say, every officer needs to hear. And so I am super excited to have you here, Dr. Landry, to hear about your research and your personal passion for sleep. So I'm thinking probably the best place to start this before you get into the topic we're going to be discussing. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself for our audience to get to know you better? Like, tell us about your journey, Glenn. How did you get so passionate about the study of sleep, and how did that bring you to where you are professionally today?
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Chris. Let me say that I came to the field honestly because I couldn't sleep as a teen. I had dutiful parents. They both working professionals. They'd be in bed by 11, and they would sleep hard until 5:36 when it was time for them to start their day. But for me, it was a completely different story. They wanted me in bed for 10:30 as a teen. And what I learned, and this really began, it started when I turned 13, but by the time I was 14, it was firmly entrenched. I just couldn't fall asleep. And what I discovered over time, didn't matter what I did, there was no way I was going to get to sleep because my brain was ready to process information at that time. I could study, I could write papers, I could do homework, and everything was easy for me from the hours from 11 o'clock at night until 4 in the morning. That was my favorite time of day, even though it wasn't day. Now, of course, what that meant is that mornings were the opposite for me. Mornings and early afternoon, my brain was just in a fog. It wasn't ready to process information at all. So I hated mornings and I just loved the night. And I thought that my life was going to be, I'd be a shift worker. I figured that my genes, I was just an extreme night owl, and that's what I was intended for. So I'm going to tell you about 3 life-changing moments. The first life-changing moment is once I got into university. I eventually took a course from Dr. Ralph Misselberger at Simon Fraser University. And let me tell you, he changed my life because he taught me that I was definitely a night owl. But he taught me all about something called circadian rhythms and sleep. Circadian rhythms are daily biological rhythms. You can think of it as we have daytime physiology, biology, and behavior. We have nighttime physiology, biology, and behavior. We need to keep those separate because they're incompatible processes. So he taught me how to take control of my circadian rhythms so that I could fall asleep at 10 o'clock at night and sleep well until 7 in the morning. And that I could wake up in the morning and be refreshed, be ready to process information, get into the lab, and my brain was ready to do everything that it used to be ready to do at 11 o'clock at night. And so I went from being a good but not great student to being able to compete and win national scholarships that funded my honors, my master's, my PhD, and eventually a postdoctoral fellowship at UBC. So that was the first real life-changing moment. Being able to be part of the day active world, but still have that sharp, crisp brain and be able to process information really quickly and remember it. So that was life-changing moment number one. Now, life-changing moment number two kind of happened at the end of my bachelor's degree before I started my journey in graduate research. And what happened is my grandparents moved to live with my parents because my grandmother had hid my grandfather's Alzheimer's disease from the family. So she had probably done that for more than a decade. And the caregiver burden really took a toll on her. She had borne that burden herself, and it accelerated her demise, her passing. And after she passed, I moved to live with my parents to help my parents care for my grandfather. And that, I learned a lot about Alzheimer's disease during that time, but I also learned a lot about the impact that sleep deprivation has and that relationship between brain health and sleep. And to give you a very quick story, my grandfather, he would roam the house at night or leave if we didn't have somebody in bed with him. So eventually what happened is my dad and I would alternate nights because my grandfather would wake up every hour at night. And as long as somebody was in bed with him, he'd come around the bed, he'd tuck us in, give us a kiss on the cheek, and then he'd get back into bed. So he wouldn't disrupt the whole house as long as somebody was in bed with him. But the problem was he was sleep depriving us. He was waking up every hour. So my dad and I would alternate nights, and I learned so much about Alzheimer's and cognitive decline and sleep during that time. So eventually my grandfather passed, and I began working toward my graduate research. And that, at that time, I also discovered that these genes that, resulted in Alzheimer's for my grandfather, they had passed down. And I've got this nasty set of genes, and those genes predispose me to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, as well as dementia. And essentially what I would say is the brain's like an engine, it produces exhaust. These genes that I have produce way more exhaust than the average person. And the life-changing moment wasn't just learning that we had these nasty genes, but in 2013, the science evolved to the point where we understood that sleep, the brain's an engine, it produces exhaust, but sleep literally washes away that exhaust. And so I have these genes, but if I'm an elite sleeper, and I'll take you through what I mean by that later in the podcast, but if I'm an elite sleeper, I can wash away the excess exhaust and it negates the impact of these genes. So on the one hand, it was like hearing that I had this life sentence that, I was predisposed to Alzheimer's, which is a horrendous disease. But by being an elite sleeper, I can negate the impact of those genes and I can live a normal life. That was such a game changer for me. And so then I figured, okay, my path is going to be, doing research, doing that hard work, publishing the research and having an impact on the world that way. Improving the world through better sleep, through these publications and advancing the science. Now, life-changing moment number 3 was after 20 plus years in the field, realizing that we already know enough to make a difference in people's lives right now. That the sleep science has evolved to the point where we know we have interventions, we can have an impact on people's sleep health. A key point about that is that for decades, we'd known that sleep changes as a normal course of aging. When I started in the field 30 years ago, it was really, you could think of it as people 70 plus. Fast forward 30 years later, we see these impacts in people. We see these impacts in people 30 plus now. It's dramatically shifted. And the reason for that is that sleep's the first thing we sacrifice to meet the growing demands of work, family, and social life balance. And so we're all shift workers, if you will. We're all adjusting our sleep schedule to meet whatever the demands are for that week or month. And that is training our ability to get sleep out of the system. We're born with the ability to get the sleep we need, but how we currently live our lives is training that out of the system. I discovered, this is 10 years ago now, I discovered that we know enough to make a difference, but what's missing is we're not translating the science into a person's individual lived experience to actually make a difference. One-size-fits-all approaches, the problem with the internet is that it tends to be a one-size-fits-all approach, and that doesn't have the impact that we really need to have. It's taking the science, applying it to a person's specific needs, and then improving their sleep health. And so that led, life-changing moment number 3, led to me deciding about 10 years ago now to go into private practice and to spend my time as a sleep coach. So that's what brings me here to you today. It's been a long journey. Yeah, undoubtedly. But we're grateful for that journey and for your expertise and how you're helping others improve their sleep. It's one of the things, I think about 28 years of policing, and in 28 years I can't remember a single session in all of that time, and when I think of all of the training and that I was provided, amazing training, but I don't think a minute of it on actually how do we understand sleep, how do we manage our sleep, how do we improve our sleep, how do we weaponize our sleep. And man, I love your point, because there really is there's no aspect of our health that isn't either negatively or positively impacted by proper sleep. So we're excited to talk to you about that today, especially with respect to tactical populations. Like, we're talking about law enforcement officers who, let's face it, they have to work shift work. That's just part of the uncontrollable domain of that job. So then understanding that they do have to do shift work and manage families and raise children and do all of these other things. I'm excited to get some insight from you, Dr. Landry, on how should they understand sleep, and specifically I'd like to talk, if we have time, from a trainer's perspective about how we understand the relationship between sleep and learning, and sleep and injuries in training, and sleep and impairment and stress injuries and those types of things. So we're off to the races, Doc, and I'm going to hand it over to you. Where would you like to start with this conversation? Well, let's start with shift work for a moment and just discuss that, because your audience and law enforcement, they come to the field with a sense, a duty to serve. And when I work with law enforcement and first responders in general, there's a key message that I want to communicate, because what I hear all the time is, Doc, my sleep is just awful. I know that my sleep is awful, but it's because of these shifts that we're working. And the first thing I want to communicate to everybody listening is that it is entirely possible to work shifts and still have circadian rhythms anchored. In other words, the poor sleep is not as much a function of the shift system as it is how we are doing the shift system. What we're doing in terms of key time cues that drive circadian rhythms. So let me unpack that briefly, because I realize that's a bit complex. What I want you to understand, and we have a training program called Surviving Shift Work, and we developed this training program over time to help individuals understand exactly what they're doing when they're doing shift work and what is driving this circadian dysregulation. The reason I bring this up is in 2010, the World Health Organization, after a thorough review of the science, determined that shift work that causes circadian dysregulation, think of that as turning your nights into days and your days into nights, which flattens out circadian rhythms. You don't get these strong day versus night circadian rhythms. So shift work that causes circadian dysregulation accelerates aging and causes cancer. And we now know the mechanisms behind that. And it is, in fact, exactly what I just said. It's turning your nights into days and your days into nights from a circadian rhythms perspective that flattens out circadian rhythms and accelerates aging and drives increased risk for not just cancer, but obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and in fact, dementia. So all those things, I have this nasty set of genes. It's the same thing. It's for a shift worker, it's as though they have those nasty genes as well. But there is hope on their horizon in the sense that when I talk to shift workers, I explain that if they anchor their circadian rhythms, it is entirely possible to take the circadian shift out of the shift work. And that's what Surviving Shift Work, the training series. Think Netflix for sleep health. That online training series is designed to help individuals do that. And we have the proof, objective data showing that it is possible to work shift work and still have great sleep. And so that is a game changer. It means that, this calling, this duty to serve, it's possible to do the job and to serve people, but not have to have the same chronic sleep deprivation that we've sort of accepted as a normal course of doing shift work. So that's critical. So that's the first thing I want to communicate. And now what I want to do is kind of take you through, moving backward now, to what chronic sleep debt does and what the impact is. And this is not just for shift workers, but for anyone. But we'll focus from a law enforcement perspective on this. So bear with me as I share my screen. And the first thing I want to show, I've been talking about how the brain's like an engine. It's producing exhaust. So from the point that we wake up, now this is sustained wakefulness that we're looking at. So we are designed for a 16-hour waking day. The brain, it quite literally is like an engine. The longer we've been awake, the greater our need for sleep. We're accumulating this toxicity, all right? And we're designed for a 16-hour waking day and then an 8-hour sleep window to get 7 hours of actual sleep. The guidance here, and this is consensus science, experts worldwide agree that the average adult 30 plus needs 7 to 9 hours of actual sleep each night. In the first 4 hours, the brain is literally washing away that toxicity. And think of it as, you've produced this exhaust, you wash away the exhaust, and then in the second half of the sleep, we use that well-washed brain and body to consolidate learning and memory, process trauma, build resilience to stressors, all of these kinds of things. And I'll take you through this sleep architecture that's responsible for that. But if we get this 8-hour sleep window, we're actually going to be able to begin the next day with a well-washed brain and body. We'll have processed everything that we needed to in terms of learning and memory, and we're good to go. That's the design. That's how the system is designed to keep us going. Now, if we don't get the sleep we need, let's say that we are, again, brain's like an engine. It's producing exhaust. If we don't get the sleep we need, then what happens is over time, we're going to accumulate toxicity. Again, brain's like an engine, is producing exhaust. If we get the sleep we need, we're good to go. But if not, we begin building up toxicity, and this builds up like a tsunami, a wave of toxicity that builds up from the front of the brain and moves its way back. And each successive night that we don't get the sleep we need, we're building this toxicity. And that, it's a decades-long process in terms of accelerating our aging and increasing our risk for Alzheimer's disease. But that impact we can also feel on a day-to-day basis. It's not just this decades-long process. There's actually an impact of, to be clear, after 3 successive short-duration sleeps, the impact is the same as having pulled one all-nighter. And I'm sure the audience has experienced having done all-nighters. I know in my graduate work I was doing sleep deprivation studies, and I did many all-nighters. Impact that I want to focus on now is not just that long-term impact, but after a few successive nights of short duration sleep, not getting the sleep we need, I want to show you what that means This part of the brain, the frontal cortex, that part of the brain is really important because it's the, if you will, it's the CEO of the brain. It's responsible for reason, logic, decision making. When we don't get the sleep we need, this control mechanism, think of it as a brake pedal. That control mechanism, it becomes non-functional or less functional. And so the brakes just don't work as well. And that matters because there are some gas pedals that I'm going to discuss with you. The first I'm going to simplify here and just call it the amygdala. And that is the emotional center of the brain. Think of it as our emotional reactivity to what's happening in our life and what's happening around us. That is an extreme gas pedal. And when we're sleep deprived, the system becomes all gas and no brake. And so what you have is a person that isn't really themselves when they're sleep deprived. And again, just to be clear, 3 successive short duration sleeps is enough to have an impact on this system where anger management becomes a challenge. The ability to control our emotions is impaired when we're sleep deprived. It's simply a gas pedal, brake pedal relationship, and we become all gas and no brake when we're sleep deprived. And we know this. We can instinctively, we feel this because little things that wouldn't normally bother us become big things when we're sleep deprived. And big things that would be a challenge become unmanageable when we're sleep deprived. So that's one gas pedal that I want you to understand. The other gas pedal is our inner adrenaline junkie, if you will. It is that appetite for risk. When we're sleep deprived, this gas pedal, the reward center of the brain, it becomes all gas and no brake in the same way. And what happens there is that our reasoning is altered. Our decision making becomes impaired. And the relationship there is that we have a tendency to underestimate the risk of a given decision and overestimate the benefit of taking that decision. That's the relationship. When we're sleep deprived, we become predisposed to risk and we underestimate really what is going to happen. In other words, we tend to become overly optimistic. We tend to think that'll never happen, but if we do this, we can overcome that. That's not going to happen. But look at this treasure trove of great things that's going to happen if we just have the courage to take a little more risk. And that is profoundly unhealthy, especially in a law enforcement. We're talking about situational awareness and being able to, think of use of force violations. Think of where an individual their situational awareness is impaired and they will not be able to respond appropriately to a given situation. Sleep-deprived individuals are at much greater risk of making poor decisions. And very often, this is an interesting point, when we look in an after-action review and we're looking at, what happened, why it happened, and we're very often blaming the individual for making poor decisions. What we need to do is look at the scenario from a sleep deprivation perspective. How well was that person sleeping in advance of that situation? And in that situation, how would a sleep-deprived brain have read that scenario? That's critical to us understanding why people do what they do. Very often we talk and, we'll say, man, this person made such a bad mistake. What were they thinking? And if that's the situation, we should be asking how well were they sleeping before they made that decision. So let me take you through what I mean by elite sleep. Okay? Elite sleep, you won't find that in a textbook, but it is my term for performance enhancing sleep. We're designed, as I say, for a 16-hour waking day, an 8-hour sleep window. Remember, now this is my sleep architecture. This is Fitbit data that I'm going to be discussing. I need more sleep than the average person, so my sleep window that I'm shooting for is 10 to 7. That's a 9-hour sleep window, and I'm really trying to get at least 8 hours of actual sleep. Now, in order to get what I call elite sleep, the brain must be ready for sleep at the time I've scheduled it, because it has to anticipate that sleep window so that it can prepare for the window and make the most of that sleep window. And as long as I've done the things I need to do to prepare for a healthy sleep, think of it as build a strong sleep window, protect that sleep window with what you do during the day as well as at night when you can't sleep. If I do those things, we have physiological processes that drive sleep architecture, the staging of sleep. And those physiological processes will balance the books appropriately as long as I build a sleep window, protect it, and let my sleep accountant balance the books each night. And what does that look like? Well, elite sleep, my brain is ready for sleep at the time I've scheduled it, so it doesn't take me a long time to get into sleep. But not only that, having fallen asleep, I'm able to get into deep sleep very quickly. And deep sleep is actually the sleep that we've been talking about that washes the brain. From that point on, there's this 90-minute cycle alternating from non-REM sleep into REM sleep and then back into non-REM. And that continues throughout the sleep window. And if I have a long enough sleep window, I'm going to get at least 5, but I plan for 6 bouts of REM. I'm going to get at least 7 hours of actual sleep, but I, of course, am scheduling for 8 hours of actual sleep to overcome these nasty genes that I have. And the other thing I want to really draw the audience's attention to is if I were to break the sleep window into 2 halves, in the front half, a lot of that time in sleep is spent in deep, slow wave sleep. And then in the back half, a lot of the time is spent alternating from light sleep into REM. Now there's a reason why that's so important. So the first thing to really talk about is this deep sleep. And we've discussed this already, but deep sleep is the stage of sleep that is critical for growth, repair, and restoration. It's also really important for immune system function. One thing to really cover very quickly, I'm a science guy. I believe very strongly in vaccinations. Vaccines are only as effective as an individual's ability to use the vaccine. And sleep, think of it as how well a person has slept in the 7 to 10 days in advance of getting a vaccine. That has a huge impact on the individual's response to the vaccine. So think of it as it is a well-slept brain and body in advance of a vaccination, and then a well-slept body following that vaccine. So sleep plus vaccine plus sleep results in the best immune response to the vaccine in terms of building up all of the antibodies that will protect an individual. That same relationship is true when we talk about injury risk. So you mentioned it earlier. When we're training, we're exposing our brain, our body to this training. And from a physical perspective, we're actually doing damage to our bodies when we're training. It is sleep plus training plus sleep that is going to give you the biggest gains. And those gains will come without the use of steroids or other performance-enhancing drugs. In fact, what I would tell you is that if you're getting sleep plus training plus sleep, you don't need the drugs. You will get the maximum benefit from the training. So that's deep sleep. Now let's talk about light sleep. Light sleep is a misnomer. Light sleep doesn't mean poor sleep necessarily. In fact, light sleep is really important for processing the day. So in our stages of light sleep, we're processing the day. And, during the day, we are inundated with a ton of information and stimulation. Some of that is critically important for future success, and the rest is just noise that needs to be discounted or eliminated from the system. And so light sleep processes the day and prioritizes what's critical to be consolidated and learned from and what can be discounted and eliminated. Light sleep is also really important for consolidation of learning and memory for a particular kind of learning, and that is skill acquisition. So think of it as any kind of muscle memory that we need to consolidate and really process, that's light sleep. Now, what I want you to think about it is, when we talk about athletes, we talk about people getting into the zone. Well, really, if we were to define the zone, it's the ability to take the training and execute the training in an environment without thought. It's the ability to read and react without actually having to think through what the right things to do are. It is the instincts necessary that drive success. That is light sleep. Processing the day, prioritizing new learning, and developing and consolidating skill acquisition so that that learning becomes instinctive. We're able to read, react, respond, situational awareness, all of these kinds of things. That's light sleep. Now, sure.
Sorry to interrupt. So here's what I'm thinking. What just occurred to me as you went through that is some agencies, when they're running like their tactical operators courses, their induction courses for tactical members or ERT, emergency response teams, is they will intentionally put their people into a sleep debt condition for the purpose of them learning how to develop their mental toughness, their ability to maintain focus while they're in that fatigued, mentally and psychologically, physiologically fatigued state. However, if I'm understanding what you're saying, there may be a role for doing that for a specific purpose. But what we have to be super careful about, if I've heard you correctly, is putting somebody now into a learning environment, expecting them to learn new information and consolidate it while they're in that sleep deprived state. So it's almost like do you then have to decide, well, what's the purpose of sleep deprivation? Is it for this, but not for new learning? We're not actually introducing our people or expecting them to do new learning. We're expecting them to demonstrate mental toughness, learn focus, resiliency, all that stuff. What would you say to that?
I would say that there is a role for it. But what we need to do is understand, why are we putting people through this training process? If it's learning how to respond to an environment when we're sleep deprived, that's a skill. That's important. But there's a process to developing skills. So you hit the nail on the head. What I would want what trainers should be thinking of is, okay, if there's a skill set that we need to hardwire and we need people to have that entrenched in their system, we should, as I mentioned, emphasize sleep plus that training plus sleep so that they've consolidated that. They've got that successfully acquired. That skill is hardwired now. And then from that point, you can move on to a sleep deprivation mode where they are now learning to take that skill set and apply it in a challenging environment that could involve being sleep deprived, so that people learn how to use their skills in this challenging environment. But if you want people to get the skill set first, I think it's sleep plus skill acquisition plus sleep. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you for clarifying that.
All right. So now we've talked about light sleep, but now let's talk about REM sleep, because REM sleep is also critical for consolidating learning and memory, and it is also processing the day, but in a different way. REM sleep is critical for knowledge acquisition, and in particular, complex concepts, things that are difficult to process and learn. REM sleep is really important for that. And the reason is that REM sleep boosts our creative thinking. It boosts our ability to be creative problem solvers. And one of the things, if you're trying to understand, well, why would it be REM sleep that does that? I want you to think about a time when you were perseverating on a problem. You were processing and you were trying to solve a problem during your waking day, and everything just seemed out of reach. You just couldn't come up with the solution. But then you slept, you woke up in the morning, and all of a sudden you were like, it's simple. If I just do this, that's my solution. It is REM sleep that gives us that creative problem solving ability. And essentially what I want you to think of it is, when we're dreaming, anything is possible. During our waking lives, we're bounded by so many rules, regulations, and there's a way that we must do things, at least in our minds, during our waking lives. But during dreams, anything's impossible, and we can get outside the box, and we can make connections that aren't obvious to us in our waking day. That's the driver of this creative problem solving. So REM sleep is absolutely crucial for that. Another thing that REM sleep is really important for, we talked about this a little bit when I talked about decision making and situational awareness. REM sleep is critical for threat assessment, being able to accurately read a situation and apply training to that situation. That is REM sleep. REM sleep is so important for building resilience to stressors. Again, I mentioned earlier that when we're sleep deprived, little things that wouldn't normally bother us become big things. Think about this for the parents in the audience. Parents of a young child. You're at the mall, and your young child is just so focused on the newest toy that just came out, and they can see it in the window, and they're like, man, I gotta have that toy. And you're like, no, this isn't the time. Or maybe it's an ice cream or some kind of treat that they want. But whatever it is, the child has decided this is the hill they're going to die on. This is it. This is critical. They must have it. And you're, as a parent, being in that situation, you're just like, oh no, I can see this happening. Please don't make me parent you in this crowded mall. All of a sudden, the kid pitches a fit, is having this temper tantrum, and you as a parent are looking at your child, and you're not calling psych services and saying this person's mentally unstable and needs, professional help. As a parent, hey, it's going to be okay. You just need a nap. We got to get you home. You're going to take a nap, and everything's going to be okay. We know that as adults and parents for our children, but this disconnect exists when we become adults. For some reason, we think we don't need the sleep, we don't need the nap, that we can push through and persevere, and there is an impact. We become moody, we become irrational when we're sleep deprived, and we can't read and react. We're not as resilient. But it's not just that. Our ability to process a traumatic event is impaired when we aren't sleep deprived. A key point that I want you to, think of is that first responders, they are exposed to more trauma than in a month's worth of shifts. They're going to be exposed to more traumatic scenes than most people would in an entire lifetime. And truthfully, for a first responder, they arrive on scene and they're attending an individual who is having the worst day of their life. But it's just another day for a first responder. The issue that I want you to understand is that involuntarily, each one of those scenes, each one of those events is a traumatic event. And it's like a rock, and this first responder's got a backpack, and they just fill the backpack with a rock for each one of those scenes. Now, sleep, REM sleep in particular, actually empties the backpack. What it does is it takes that rock and it processes the event, the traumatic event. It removes the negative emotional tag to that new learning event, and it processes the new learning and eliminates that negative tag. When we don't get the REM sleep we need, what happens is that we can be triggered by an event. And we'll get right into, think of it as sympathetic nervous system overdrive. So that's the fight or flight response. And so something that is related can trigger this traumatic memory, and we go right into fight or flight, right into that adrenaline response. And that is a lack of REM sleep. If we get the REM sleep we need, we can process the trauma. We can stay ahead of that backpack filling. I think we've kind of pummeled everyone with information so far, but that's really what I want people to take away from, the importance of sleep health in understanding, a first responder's perspective, law enforcement perspective in terms of all of that.
So one question that immediately came to mind on the last couple of slides there, Doc, is, some agencies have adopted a practice where they allow their officers to nap while on duty. So they'll actually have a quiet room at the station or something where they can go and get 20-minute, 30-minute nap or something like that. Like, with respect to, does napping help with all of that you just spoke about, with the resilience, the emotional regulation, the situational awareness and all that kind of stuff? What should we understand about napping? Is it a thing, or are we at with that?
Thanks for the question. That's really important. So I talked about the parent-child relationship and realizing that the child is not psychotic, that the child needs a nap. The same is true for adults. Naps are absolutely critical. They are programmed into our day. There is a time when we're programmed to have a nap. So let me take you through that. Earlier, I showed that, we're designed for a 16-hour waking day and then an 8-hour sleep window to get 7 hours of actual sleep. That restores and refreshes everything. It's a hard reset. We're good to go. Napping is designed in there as well because think of it as life gets in the way. We're not always going to get that great night of sleep. So even if we try, things are going to get in the way and something can happen. Maybe we'll wake up and we'll be worried about, what happened the previous day or what didn't happen and what needs to happen. All these things can play a role. And so what's built into the system is a nap window. And understanding the nap window is critical to getting the benefit of the nap. So let's do a little math here. Let's say that we've got a routine bedtime. That is our, day schedule. We've got a night's sleep and our routine bedroom that we kind of protect. As I said, build a sleep window, protect a sleep window. So we've got this sleep window. And what I want you to do is from the time that you've scheduled your wake up, I want you to add 6 hours. So let's imagine that wake up is 6 in the morning. Well, then 12 in the afternoon, 6 hours later, that's when the nap window opens. And then what I want you to do is subtract 6 hours from your bedtime. So let's say that your bedtime is 10 o'clock. You've got a nice 8-hour window, 10 at night to 6 in the morning. I know that that's a lot to ask for your audience, but let's just imagine that's the case. So going to bed at 10, subtract 6 hours, that means 4 p.m. That's when the nap window closes. As long as we know the nap window, in this example, 12 to 4. During that time, our brain is programmed to actually use a nap to bleed off excess sleep needs. So if you aren't getting the sleep you need at night, that time from 12 to 4 in this example is when you can get a good solid nap. Now, what is a nap? Average individual who isn't a shift worker, a good nap is, let's call it 45 minutes. Okay? The sweet spot is about 45 minutes, but not everybody can carve out 45 minutes for a nap. Let me be very clear. Earlier I talked about, we're designed for a 16-hour waking day. That's sustained wakefulness with the exception of the nap window. And if we go beyond those design limits, this is an important discussion. If we go beyond the design limits of 16 hours and we start sustaining wakefulness for say 17 hours, if we do 16, we'll be unimpaired. That's what the design is for. 16 hours of waking performance that's unimpaired. But when we go to 17, there are these impairments that begin to make themselves obvious from an objective point of view. Like we can study them and see them. And at 17 hours, it's the equivalent of having a blood alcohol level of 0.05, let's say. When we go beyond 17 into 18 and 19 hours, the blood alcohol equivalent is in the neighborhood of 0.08. That's, the legal limit in Canada. When we go beyond 21 hours of sustained wakefulness, the blood alcohol equivalent impairment is 0.10. That's like sloppy drunk. You know this. Your audience will know this well. It's that impairment that we need to account for. And naps are an awesome strategy to address that. A 10-minute nap, a power nap, your audience I'm sure is familiar with that terminology. A power nap of 10, 15 minutes can buy you this extended wakefulness because you're breaking up the sustained wakefulness in these chunks. And if you do that during the nap window, you get maximum value. So even a 10-minute nap can be beneficial, sweet spot of 45 minutes. If you are not a shift worker, in other words, if you don't have to do daytime sleeps between night shifts, if that's not the case, then you don't want the nap to be longer than, say, 90 minutes. Because if it goes longer than 90 minutes, that's not a nap, that's daytime sleeping, and so that's going to impair your ability to get the sleep you need at night. But if you follow that formula, you can get, say, a 45 up to a 90-minute nap during the day. You can recover some sleep debt that you've accumulated, and it won't impair your ability to get a good night's sleep. Now let's talk about the day sleepers. For day sleepers between night shifts, you can use that nap window to extend the sleep. For a lot of these shift workers, they make the mistake of coming home and going straight to sleep after their night shift. And what happens is they'll be able to sleep for about 3, maybe hours, but they wake up and they can't get back to sleep. And now they've only had a few hours of sleep, and now they got to get into another night shift, and they're going to be even more sleep deprived in successive night shifts. The strategy that we provide for individuals that take our training, and to be clear, it's important to take the Surviving Shift Work training system to understand these principles, but just to give you an example, what we say is after the night shift, you're going to get some light, get some activity, and get your meal. That would be your breakfast. And then a few hours after that, you can go to sleep so that you begin your sleep and you've got 3-4 hours to get you into the beginning of the afternoon lull, that nap window. And then you can use that nap window to extend the sleep so that you're getting not 3 to 4 hours of sleep during your day sleep between night shifts, but you're actually getting more like 6 or 7 hours of actual sleep. That's huge, and that's how you can use circadian programming to take the circadian shift out of shift work. So, that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, no, but super helpful. And I'm hoping, one of the takeaways for our listeners or officers who are working shift work, pulling those night shifts, is the value if you have the ability to pull your vehicle into the precinct parking lot where it's secure and park in a quiet place and even grab a 15 or 20 minute nap if that's all you can get. But from what I'm hearing you say, Doc, there could be some very good benefits to that as far as decision making, perception, situational awareness, cognitive functioning, all of that.
Absolutely. Otherwise you're impaired. It's like driving drunk. And a key point on that, we talked about the nap window, but when you're pulling the night shift, anytime is a good time, because anytime's a good time for a nap, and you could have multiple naps during that time just to buy you extended wakefulness without impairment. So, what you want to do is you want to be opportunistic with your nap strategy during the night shift. And then when you're on the days, you want to use that nap window to, bleed off excess sleep need.
Right. Okay. So now one of the things that officers will often do when they're working and they're feeling that sleep pressure come on them is they'll use a tool called caffeine to try to maintain more sustained wakefulness and attentiveness. And so can you talk to us about, is there a role for caffeine? And if so, what is it? And is there a dark side to be aware of with that?
Absolutely. So let's be clear. Caffeine's a stimulant. And very often when I'm working with shift workers, they'll say, Doc, you don't have to worry about caffeine because I can drink, coffee. And I could have a coffee at the end of my shift and I can still fall asleep, no problem. I'm exhausted. The caffeine is just getting me through. And then I fall asleep. And this is why it's so important to look at sleep architecture, because we must get beyond this notion that any sleep is good sleep. We have to understand sleep architecture. If you look at individuals that are having caffeine right before or even in the hours before going to bed, what you'll see is that the sleep is fragmented. That they're not spending as much time in deep sleep or REM sleep, and that they're spending much more time in light sleep. And earlier I said that light sleep isn't necessarily poor sleep, but if it means that you're getting light at the expense of deep and REM, then it is poor sleep. And so just because you can fall asleep doesn't mean you are getting good sleep. And so let's talk about caffeine for a moment. What you want to make sure is that at the point that you're sleeping, caffeine isn't still in your system, because it's going to fragment your sleep architecture. And now let's do a little math here. From the point that you have your last coffee, let's talk about half-life, the time it takes for half of that coffee to be processed and metabolized out of your system. If you are, an experienced caffeine user, if you're really good at metabolizing and processing that caffeine, the half-life is about 3 hours, okay, to use round numbers. So let's say that you have your last coffee at noon. At 3 o'clock, you've got about 50% in your system. At 6, you got 25%. At 9 o'clock, you've got 12.5% of this caffeine still in your system. At midnight, you're going to have 6.25% still in your system. So even 12 hours later, the caffeine's in your system. But if that's your bedtime, you can fall asleep and it'll continue wearing off so that it's not going to have as much of an impact. But you really do want to be finished your caffeine consumption at least 12 hours before your intended bedtime. Now that's hard to do when you're doing shift work, but let me tell you, a much better way of, eliminating that fatigue is to get physical activity and bright light exposure. That stimulates the wake components of the brain, and so that's actually more beneficial than caffeine. So we have a tendency to, rely on higher and higher doses, Monster Energy, 5-Hour Energy, higher and higher doses of caffeine. And in some of those examples, we're getting a ton of sugar as well. And that is disastrous for our brain health.
Okay, well, so that's a big bummer. That's a downer.
Well, the good news is light, right? Like understanding.
So talk to me about light.
Yeah, this is the importance. What you'll see right now, if you can see my camera, is that it may not come across, but I am in bright light right now. And so that's, 10,000 light. It's super bright white light, and it's providing me a day signal. It's saying this is clearly day. It's turning off sleep-promoting areas of the brain and turning on wake-promoting areas of the brain. That's bright light is super stimulating. That's important because it's actually more potent than caffeine would be. So yes, it's a bummer. We've been, relying on caffeine, and that is a bummer to say, well, caffeine's going to impact your ability to get the sleep you need. But if you can wean yourself and get the proper timing of caffeine, you're going to end up with better sleeps when you've scheduled the sleep. And that means you're going to pay off the debt better so that your wakefulness will be better during the day. And light is a huge impact on that.
Okay, and on the topic of light, I've heard a little bit about what the light from like smartphones and things like that does and how it can impair the onset of sleep as well and impair healthy sleep. Yeah. So are there, like with relation to not just the smartphone, but can you talk to us about if you had like a 5 minutes or 10 minutes to give an officer some critical health tips, some tools that they can take away to think about their sleep environment and what they can do to prepare for healthy sleep and all that, what sort of strategies would you tell them?
Okay, so let's go back to what I just said about light. Light turns off sleep-promoting areas of the brain, turns on wake-promoting areas of the brain. So that's really important. Now, the opposite is true for melatonin. Melatonin plays a role in turning off wake-promoting areas of the brain and turning on sleep-promoting areas of the brain. You follow what I'm saying there?
Yes.
When we discuss melatonin, now, your audience should not be taking melatonin. But what you want to do is provide proper, so you remember I talked about day versus nighttime physiology, biology, and behavior, so circadian rhythms. Time physiology, biology, and behavior is melatonin rising about 2 hours before our normal bedtime. And it can only do that if we are in a blue blocked or a dark environment. So for your audience that can see my camera, these blue blockers, they're orange tinted lenses. These, right now I've got bright white light that's saying this is day. And now I've got these orange tinted lenses, darker the better. Orange tinted lenses, put that over the camera and you can see this is a night signal. So day versus night is signaled by what kind of light we're getting. If we get blue, bright, white, blue rich light, then we're turning off the night and we're turning on the day. If we can eliminate that and we blue block using orange tinted lenses, then we can turn on the night and turn off the day. That is critical for understanding that the 2 hours before our intended bedtime to help prepare our brain and body for sleep. These blue blockers that I'm talking about go a long way to actually turning off the day and turning on the night.
Okay. On the topic of melatonin, before you move on with some sleep tips, a lot of people I know do take supplemental melatonin. And so my understanding, and please correct me, but my understanding is melatonin is something naturally released in the brain that allows us to enter into sleep, but isn't responsible for us remaining in sleep. So A, is that accurate? And then B, why should we not take supplemental melatonin?
It's an awesome question. All right, so you got most of that story correct. Melatonin is a really important natural hormone that prepares the brain and body for sleep. Okay, so melatonin begins rising about 2 hours before our normal bedtime. Actually, let me just bring up the melatonin slide. Bear with me. Sorry for the delay here. Share. All right. Melatonin. As I say, melatonin is a really important hormone because it begins rising a couple of hours before our predicted sleep window. Okay? That's when it begins rising naturally. It's produced by the pineal gland and it's under circadian regulation. So there's a time of day dependent impact here. 2 hours before our normal bedtime, it begins rising. It peaks in the middle of our sleep window and then it reaches its lowest point just as we're beginning our day. So that's the natural melatonin profile. It's really important because, as we said, it prepares the brain and body for sleep. But it's also important because it plays a critical role in cancer fighting. Remember earlier I said that shift work that causes circadian dysregulation causes cancer? Well, this is one of the mechanisms that shift work that results in suppressed melatonin amplitude. So getting light at night turns off melatonin. So blue light, blue-rich light turns off melatonin, and that impairs the role that melatonin plays in cancer fighting. So think of it this way. We produce cancer cells as a normal course of daily living, but we have processes in place that identify a cancer cell, target it for destruction, and destroy it. And then at that point, clear it from our system. We literally pee out those destroyed cancer cells. That's the process, and melatonin plays a role in that. So it's really, really important. Now here's the problem. I've just told you how important melatonin is, so you'd think, okay, well, I should take melatonin before bed so that I get this high amplitude melatonin and I'll be fine. Here's the problem with taking melatonin before bed. Is melatonin is actually a chronobiotic. It has an impact on circadian timing. And if we take melatonin before bedtime, I'm going to use, West Coast versus East Coast examples here. So for Canadians in the audience, melatonin before bed shifts your circadian rhythm. So you go from Vancouver time to Toronto time, or think of it as California time to New York time. And it happens in the time it takes to process this melatonin. So it's very quick. Now, the problem with that is that if you think to what I was saying earlier, individuals that have an issue with sleep, they tend to be exhausted. They tend to be able to fall asleep. The problem that most people are having is the ability to sustain sleep. And if you take melatonin before bedtime, you will fall asleep. But the melatonin is going to advance your circadian rhythms, take you from California to New York time, a 3-hour advance. And what's going to happen is you'll be able to fall asleep, but then you're going to wake up 3 hours earlier than you should, and there's no chance of you getting back to sleep. That's the problem with taking melatonin, is that it takes an existing problem and makes it worse.
So, all right. Well, we've been going for an hour, and I've just been, honestly, Doc, I've been riveted by what you've been talking about. So I'd like to give you the last few minutes here just to, do you have any other sleep tips for what our people should think about as far as their environment, their sleep environment, temperature, anything like that they may just be able to start implementing today to even help improve their sleep?
Absolutely. Thank you. So let's summarize by saying this. We've got a sleep accountant. It's a natural physiological process that can track your previous sleep-wake history, look at the kind of day you've had, and it can balance the books. Okay? And no 2 days are the same. Let's be clear about that. We've talked about sleep architecture and what you should be shooting for. No 2 days are the same. Some days may be physically strenuous, other days may involve a lot of stress, psychological trauma, all of these kinds of things. Each day is different. The sleep architecture that you need to balance the books might be slightly different. And so our natural physiology is the best way to do that. Think of it as we've got this sleep accountant and we want to unhandcuff the sleep accountant and let the sleep accountant balance the books. So the way to do that is to, as I mentioned, build a sleep window and protect that sleep window with what you do during the day in terms of your light exposure, your physical activity, and your meal times. proper circadian timing that says this is day. And then at night, by avoiding light, avoiding food, avoiding activity as best you can, so that you're protecting the nighttime signals that say this is night. So day versus nighttime signaling to promote strong circadian rhythms and allow your sleep accountant to balance the books. And now I'll finish up on one thing. The truth is, we all know what we need to do, right? We've got to eat right, we've got to exercise, we've got to get lots of sleep. But what very few people understand is that it's timing that's everything in this. There is a time of day that's right for physical activity, food, and light. And there's a time of day where you want to minimize the exposure to those things. And that's critical. In terms of the sleep environment, obviously a very dark environment is critical. Making sure that you've got noise cancellation and it's quiet, neutral temperature, all of those kinds of things that you could find on the internet. That's sleep hygiene. But what I'm emphasizing more that has the greatest impact is circadian regulation.
Okay, and so with respect to timing, I know we need to end the podcast, but you just keep talking and it just causes me to go, okay, the timing of exercise then. So if I'm a night shift worker, so I have two questions. One is around, so the circadian anchoring that you said is so important. Is there research that shows like what type of schedule is it? Should I just stay on night shifts? Is that more optimal? Or, a lot of schedules go from day shift to afternoons to night to day shifts to afternoons to night then, and others do different things. So what does the research say is if I have control over that, what is the optimal? And then for working out, for fitness, to optimize my sleep, where should that fit in that whole rhythm?
Okay, two different questions. So Let's address the first question. The shift system that is best to promote healthy circadian rhythms is the one that allows an individual to anchor their circadian rhythms so that they have very strong day versus nighttime cues. Okay, so to give you an example, a rotating shift system that is 2 12-hour days, 2 12-hour nights, and 4 off can very easily anchor circadian rhythms because you've got your 4 days off where you can be anchored to day, and then you've got your 2 day shifts that you can still be anchored to day. So 6 out of the 8-day rotation you're anchored to day. And again, like, this is complex and we certainly don't have time to go through how to do this in this podcast, but we could do it in the future. That Surviving Shift Work online training program that I mentioned, that's exactly what it does. Is it gives people the understanding about circadian rhythms and sleep so that they know how to anchor their circadian rhythms in whatever shift system that they're working on. It is possible then to anchor your day versus night physiology, and then during those 2 night shifts, what you have to do is manage your light exposure appropriately, manage your meal times appropriately, and the activity that you're getting at night. Here's the very convenient truth, is that light and meal times are much more potent than activity is in terms of a time cue. So it is possible to be active at night, but if you're managing your light exposure properly, and if you are managing your meal times properly, you can still be anchored so that the shift that you have, because you're working this night shift, it's minimized, and that the strong time cues that you're getting during your days off and your day shifts anchors you so that it minimizes the disruption on those night shifts. So that's the first part. Now, the second question that you had about physical activity and what the right time is, you're absolutely right. Timing's everything. And what I would say is it really depends on the individual. So I mentioned I'm an extreme night owl. Exercise and activity at night is problematic for me because it makes me more of a night owl. But that's actually the time when I feel best. Like, I can pump the greatest amount of weight when I'm predisposed for that. The truth, though, is that for me as an extreme night owl, I need to be doing my exercising in the morning hours to reinforce that this is the beginning of day. So it's not when I feel at my best, but that signaling for physical activity is perfect for a night owl. Now, the reverse is true for an early bird. An early bird is a person that really struggles to stay up late and is predisposed to early mornings. That's when they feel best. Exercise early in the morning is just going to make them more of an early bird. So an early bird needs to exercise in the evenings to extend their day. And so that's how you have to manage the timing. Now, I suspect that most of your audience that's working night shifts, they tend to be night owls more because that's, one of the perks of these shifts is they get 4 days off and they can be a night owl. So it's important to be able to figure out, who you are. Are you a night owl? Are you an early bird? That's what we call chronotype. It's very easy to figure that out. If, for you, the party doesn't get started until like midnight and it's like 1 or 2 where you're really getting your swole on and feeling good, you're a night owl. If you love the mornings and it's hard for you to sleep past, 5 in the morning and you're thinking to yourself, man, why would I waste the day? And at night, if you're like, it's 9 o'clock and you're looking at your watch and you're thinking, man, we gotta go. It's just like bedtime. You're an early bird. That's how you know. And if neither of those things are true for you, then you're right in the middle. You're neither an early bird or a night owl. So that's how you figure out your chronotype. And then timing your exercise is really about figuring out, how do you not emphasize or become more of a night owl or more of an early bird? That's what you want to try to do.
Okay, that's amazing. That's actually counterintuitive because
yes,
like I'm definitely an early bird. When 9 o'clock hits, I'm looking for where's my pillow, and then I usually get up at 4, and then I'm in the gym by 4:30 in the morning, and I'm working out then because that's when I feel the most.
That's when you feel best.
Yeah,
but you are making yourself more of an early bird by doing that.
Okay, that's fascinating. Wow. Well, Dr. Landry, we need to land this podcast. But I would like you just talk a little bit as we close about your surviving shift work program that you have. What is that like, and how can our audience find out more about that?
Oh, that's an awesome. Thank you. Okay, so surviving shift work, as I mentioned, think of it as Netflix for sleep health. It's an online training program. It's 10 lessons, takes about 6.5 hours to get through all of the lessons. And finding it, you just go online. If you go to neosperformance.com, I'm sure you'll provide that in the link. Yeah. neosperformance.com, you'll be able to find that online training, and you can sign up for that. And if anybody has questions, please feel free to email me at Glenn with 2 N's, Glenn@neosperformance.com, and I'll reach out. Let me know that you heard about us through the Trainer's Bullpen, and I will answer your questions.
Perfect. And Neos, that's NEOS performance.com, correct?
Correct.
Great. Dr. Landry, thank you so much for your time. You've given us a lot to think about, and actually probably we do need to have you back on to dive more deeply into many of those concepts. But thank you for your time, sir.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.